Global, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-technic shamanism.
Synchro-mystic.
Transformation of consciousness.
Such an incredible connection to this medicine and this culture.
Mystical.
That we can form a larger community that can make the invisible visible.
We're going to come into new expressions of
Where did psychedelics come from?
The sacred mirrors were based on a psychedelic experience.
Thank you, Palenque Norte.
Welcome to Palenque Norte. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Palenque Norte, Day 2, continued. We got a great lineup this afternoon. Daniel Pinchbeck's about to speak, and we'll have John Allen, Rick Doblin, and others later tonight. So thank you for joining us. I wanted to say a little note here about this cool chandelier we have in the center of the cavern with us. This is actually Timothy Leary's chandelier that was generously given to us to use this week by Bruce Damer. So we have that to continue more psychedelic discussions under. So I'm sure many of you already know who Daniel is. Daniel Pinchbeck is New York Times bestselling author of Breaking Open the Head in 2012, Return of Quetzalcoatl. He's also the editorial director of Reality Sandwich and an iconic figure in the recent psychedelic movement. So without further ado, here's Daniel.
So yeah, I was thinking I might experiment and do this more as a largely Q&A or discussion. I think the same ideas will emerge, and probably some of you here. I mean, how many people here know my work to some extent? So if you've thought about the ideas and so on, and you have like really a question that compelled you or that you kept thinking about, I thought I would give you the opportunity to ask that and have a little bit more of a back and forth than is usual for these formats. But I'll start just by introducing myself and my work a little bit. So yeah, I'm the author of a number of books. The two books, Breaking Open the Head, came out in 2002, and it was about psychedelic shamanism. I visited different cultures around the world, like the Bwiti tribe in West Africa, who use iboga in their ceremonies, which is now being used in the West as an experimental treatment for addictions, especially heroin addiction. And I wrote about ayahuasca in that book. I hung out with the tribe in the Ecuador called the Sequoia tribe, worked with them, went down to Mexico, to Oaxaca, to visit one of Maria Sabina's descendants, where the mushrooms were discovered in the 50s by Gordon Wasson. I also wrote about Burning Man in the book, looked at a lot of ideas, like Terence McKenna's ideas of the archaic revival. Really, the book was really an effort. I started as a grew up as a scientific materialist in an artistic background, but I had no spiritual belief system. I thought that consciousness was just brain-based, and ultimately this led me to a kind of nihilistic feeling of kind of like meaninglessness and emptiness. So I decided to see if I could really make a inquiry into my own skepticism and what would be kind of like the tools that I could use for that. And at that point I remembered my psychedelic experiences from college, so I decided to make that my area of inquiry, because those had been the most profound door-opening experiences that I'd ever had. So what happened during the course of writing Breaking Open the Head, there's plenty of room, guys, if you want to come up front or whatever, maybe leave a little corridor in case people keep coming in. What happened during the course of writing Breaking Open the Head is I had a series of experiences, personal experiences, with psychedelics in shamanism, and then also kind of filtering into my dream life, my ordinary life, that over time really convinced me that the shamanic worldview had a lot of validity, and these other realms, these that there were these other realms of the psyche that our modern culture had denied and suppressed. And then that really led me to think, and that happened through even kind of classically kind of occult experiences of incredible synchronicities or things manifesting in strange ways and so on. So, and I covered that in the book. And as I said, I began skeptically, and it was just step by step having an experience, kind of measured against things that I read, against the other people who I met. I began to collect so many anecdotes about people who'd had similar type experiences, and ultimately it led me to a profound shift in my worldview. where I recognized that the materialist scientific paradigm was a little bit stuck, and that we, in a sense, the modern West had kind of neglected, suppressed, even violently repressed these other dimensions of the psyche. And if you go back through the history of Europe and so on, you look at the witch hunts in the Middle Ages, and the witches were like the wise women who possessed the knowledge of working with visionary plants and possessed kind of access to these like intuitive and visionary domains. They were hunted out, tried to be driven to extinction. And similarly, when we went on our imperialist missions, if we found these intact shamanic cultures, we would often destroy the cultures, destroy the shamans, even destroy the knowledge, as we burned all the books of the Aztecs and the Maya, pretty much. So while writing Breaking Open the Head, I discovered that a lot of thought had sort of constellated around this idea that we were heading towards a kind of transformation in planetary consciousness and planetary civilization. And Terence McKenna was one thinker around this, who through a whole series of psychedelic experiences that he had kind of beamed into this idea that there was this acceleration taking place of creativity and novelty, technological evolution, destruction of the biosphere, and that somehow this was going to culminate almost like a change of state, which he called the singularity or the eschaton. And I guess one way to think about it, a friend of mine used the metaphor recently of like, water sort of slowly heating up, sort of going into finally a bubbling state and then turning into gas, So you could look at like human history as the warming up phase. Perhaps we're now in that bubbling phase, and we don't really know what the steam phase is like yet, but we're beginning to get like faint intimations, So I looked at Terence's work, and Jose Arguelles was one of the big thinkers on the Mayan calendar, and in a sense, I think much more systemically than McKenna understood that we tend to have this idea that these indigenous civilizations didn't really possess knowledge. They had myth or folktale or legend, that somehow they hadn't really developed the level of sophisticated thought that we've developed. And looking at these cultures from a different angle, like Egypt or the Maya, it may be that they actually had like a profound spiritual science, or even different aspects of a spiritual science. And for the Maya, the particular focus of it seems to have been understanding this, let's say, like spiraling nature of time, these cycles that lead to new cycles, what they actually call different world ages, or different worlds. So they talked about the transition from the age of the fifth sun, or to the age of the sixth sun, as a way to think about this time, or the Hopi talk about the fourth world to the fifth world. So learning about all this stuff really led me to think about, really want to study this idea of, was there some type of transformation coming? How many people here sort of feel that that's the case? That we're kind of in this accelerating, we recognize that it's unsustainable, that either we're going to crash land and have a desolate scenario, or we're going to make some rapid transformation or evolution in a direction that we don't quite know or can anticipate yet. So so my second book was called 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, and for 4 or 5 years I really began to study these indigenous prophecies, and then also look at a lot of Western thinkers, because I felt like to take these ideas and make them understandable, comprehensible, we had to find ways of articulating them, in our own language, So then philosophy became really key to me, looking at thinkers like Nietzsche and Heidegger and Carl Jung and Rudolf Steiner and a whole bunch of other ones who provided, kind of access points, ways that we could see these articulations, and then we could all, you can also sort of integrate the different ways people are looking at this transformation process and begin to see that they're actually saying the same things from different angles, So that was a lot of the work of 2012 was my own personal journey exploring the prophecies in different ways, which took me, for instance, back into psychedelics, working with the Santo Daime in Brazil, which is a ayahuasca-based religion that also has a kind of prophetic understanding of this time that's very similar. Took me to the crop circles in England, which was another phenomenon that at first I was extremely skeptical about. I wrote a piece about them for Wired. I began to interview all these people who'd been researching them in great depth. And then I was able to then go and spend a summer down there and visit in different formations just as they appeared, interview the whole range of people involved with the phenomenon, including artists who claim to be making them, but ending up, through really trying to be as diligent and scrupulous about the research as possible, basically convinced that they couldn't entirely be a human-made phenomenon, that some other type of consciousness or intelligence in the cosmos was communicating to us through those formations. So one thing that's fun about where I'm at is like I'm not connected to the academy or the mainstream media, so I have the freedom as a thinker to explore stuff that would implode most people's careers, or would just not get them allowed to speak, So I take that very seriously and keep trying to delve into these areas of kind of cultural resistance. And usually when I see like a certain reaction, like almost like a negative or hostile reaction, sometimes I'm like, oh, that's almost a good sign, because it means that there's like hitting a nerve there, and there's because everything should be up for debate and discussion and inquiry, So yeah, so in 2012 I ended up developing the theory that what we're undergoing, is not the end of the world or some type of cataclysmic destruction. We may see some of that. We may see more and more of it. But really it's about a transformation of planetary consciousness and planetary civilization. I resonate with a lot of the ideas of people like Buckminster Fuller and Barbara Marx Hubbard, who talks about us making a shift from kind of just being in the inertia of the evolutionary process to reaching another level of consciousness where we become co-creative with the evolutionary process, which means that we recognize it's like we move from unconscious to conscious choice, and from that position we can rethink and redesign society, so that it really supports biodiversity and and local communities, and kind of a whole holistic approach to healing the ills of the planet. And that was very much the focus of a documentary that I made also called 2012 Time for Change, where we took the kind of philosophical ideas from my book, which were looking at kind of these different world incarnations as forms of consciousness, and trying to kind of identify what this next level of consciousness would be. For instance, how it might involve like a shift in our perception of time and space, And I didn't want to go that deep. I really did want to have questions, so I'm not going to talk for too much longer. I mean, where that's led me since writing that book was so it's all been like for me it's been a very logical and rational process. From recognizing that going through the psychedelic initiation process, recognizing that we'd suppressed all these dimensions of psychic and shamanic reality, really almost the most interesting aspects of being human, maybe, and that we now potentially could reintegrate the mystical and the shamanic into our modern scientific technoculture as part of a transition in worldview and a transition in how we live on the planet. And so having sort of worked through that, then the next question for me is like, it no longer seemed to be enough to just be a writer or a thinker or whatever. I wanted to figure out how I could assist in this transition process. And that led me to start a company, Evolver, which has both a nonprofit and a for-profit side. And it really began because I began to get so many incredible emails from people who had their own stories like similar to mine, or in very profound ideas that were mind-blowing, and I felt they were just sending them to me directly because there was no forum in the media that would actually really hold the information well and allow for a dialogue to develop around it. So we created a web magazine, Reality Sandwich, kind of just as a prototype and a test, and we saw it pick up really quickly, and that so many people had incredible essays and articles to publish. We never paid anybody for anything. And so that blossomed very quickly, and then we began to realize that everybody who was reading the articles really wanted to find each other. So that kind of led us to start Evolver as a kind of social networking scaffolding. And we began to think about, well, how do you, we basically have a, the biggest problem on Earth is, I think, a consciousness problem, and people aren't even aware, of all the types of, like, most people don't even know what sustainability is really, or haven't even, and I don't even like that concept. I think that concept is already in the rearview mirror, but most people haven't even gotten to that point, so how are we going to, we see that the media systemically suppresses, helpful and valuable information, so and the government is not going to help us out, and the corporations are not going to help us out. So there would need to be some type of civil society self-organization to, really raise consciousness, to, create, to make sure that people were kind of re-educated around a whole set of new principles and ideas. So that's what we started with Evolver, the nonprofit, which is called the Evolver Network. The tag is building community for the new planetary culture. So it's kind of using a fractal model where these groups start, we give them some direction from above. We do monthly events that are around different themes, but it's not necessary that every group follow those themes. It's really up to the local organizers to be receptive and responsive to what's going to work in their community. So if somebody's in Brownsville, Texas, showing a movie like DMT, the Spirit Molecule, is just not even, no one is even going to have a context for even thinking about that. But they could begin an Evolver group where they're teaching people how to grow some of their own food, or basic nutrition, so they're not always just eating like, starch and junk food and bad meat or whatever. So really trying to meet people where they are and then evolve their consciousness and open them to, a whole set of new possibilities, and really seeing that, as potentially extremely difficult this transition is going to be in the next few years, it could also be really amazing. And in a sense, most people have sort of, they've gone to sleep, or they've allowed like rust to cover over their souls, and it's only by being forced into this crisis maybe that we're all going to be forced to scrub off the rust, And I've seen, since coming to Burning Man from the beginning, that, in a way what you have of the people at Burning Man are kind of like the ultimately may become kind of like the planetary emergency, recuperation society or something. The ones who are going to have to, go to different communities to become ambassadors for these types of ideas and principles and practices, and really, do the work to communicate and convey them, to people who haven't yet been exposed or don't understand yet. So let me take a question. I mean, I can go in so many different directions, but if somebody has like something they really want to ask me, they should just raise their hand. Or do you want me? Yeah, go ahead. Take the mic. Take the mic.
You were saying that consciousness may be one of the most pressing needs right now, and it seems to me that overpopulation is a major problem, and that is being funded by the corporate religions, or however you want to call that. And you never hear it mentioned anywhere, and what can be done about overpopulation and sustainability?
Well, I mean, probably the best way to begin to address overpopulation is to equalize and liberate women in societies around the world, because as soon as women's power approaches that of men, the birth rate starts to decline rapidly to below replacement levels. Okay, so and I think that, I mean, I'm a little bit leery around making population the big issue, because that can also quickly turn into a kind of elitist thing, like, who gets to survive or whatever. I mean, at the moment, we're using the resources of the planet incredibly inefficiently. I mean, this was Buckminster Fuller's, whole thing was that, we really have the resources to create, a decent way of life and being for everybody on Earth, if the resources are allocated differently. So for instance, in New York City, we interviewed these aquaponics people for my film, and they said that if you had green roofs all over New York, you could be growing like 80% of the food for the city right there. At the moment, the average morsel of food is traveling 2,000 miles to get to the city. So that's just incredibly inefficient. We don't even really know if those, if we had the co-creative capacity to redesign our systems so that they were actually functioning efficiently, maybe we could support 7 billion. Maybe we would still see that population go down because a lot of those children are being born out of desperate circumstances, which need to be addressed. One of the ways of thinking about this that I really love is from a book called Spontaneous Evolution by Steve Behrman, a political scientist, and Bruce Lipton, a cell biologist. And their hypothesis is that we're kind of reaching an evolutionary threshold where we're going to self-realize humanity as one collective organism, in a symbiotic relationship with the Earth. And they look at that in parallel with the evolution of all sorts of ecosystems, which when they're immature ecosystems are marked by competition and aggression and territoriality. But once they find a way to synergize or become symbiotic, they go into a different mode. And the example they use is our own bodies, which are these vast colonies of microorganisms that somehow at a certain point in the evolutionary process, instead of competing, they began to collaborate and form these more complex organs. So our bodies are these masterpieces of symbiosis, and you don't have the liver attacking the lymph nodes and so on. So the idea would be that if we were to reach this, attain the self-realization of humanity as one singular organism, we would rethink all the flows of resources, in an efficient way. So we can go more into that, but I think that's a helpful way to think about it. Oh, and the other thing I wanted to say about it is, we also don't know exactly the destiny of what's up. I mean, Alan Watts used to talk about how, in a way, just in the same way the apple tree apples, like it's natural for the apple tree to create an abundance of apples, the earth peoples. The earth seems to like peopling. Maybe the earth is peopling in the same way an apple tree apples, because those seeds are ultimately going to go to other fields, in other places. Maybe we are meant to become a spacefaring species and terraform and colonize other worlds, and what seems like a surplus of people now, might have a whole purpose in the larger scheme of things, Hold on, give him the mic.
Any thoughts on consciousness itself, whether it might be top down or bottom up, or what it is?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Well, I mean, I guess my sort of ultimately where I arrived in terms of my own mystical, perspective was pretty much identical to, Vedanta, which is Hindu mysticism, and this idea that there's ultimately, one consciousness that in order to learn about its creative capacities, fragments itself into these separate individual identities, which then explore and discover different aspects, of the whole,
That would be the opposite of evolution then, top down.
Well, it's not really the opposite. I mean, I think also like part of the shift in our way of thinking is from dualities to polarities. Like dualities, it's like black or white. Polarities are like, the yin yang symbol, where you have the black has some white in it and the white has some black in it. So the opposites kind of include each other and mesh with each other. So you definitely have bottom evolution up, happening, but at the same time, yeah, you may have. I mean, this is what Amit Goswami, who's a physicist and a kind of Indian thinker, wrote a book called The Self-Aware Universe. And he basically argued very similar to Aurobindo's ideas that there's like a sort of an underlying consciousness which is organizing itself back to that kind of original freedom that it had by using kind of like the hardware imprints of the physical form and then the software imprints of the mind, and then iterating and evolving itself so that it rediscovers its own original creative freedom. And Aurobindo talked about that as a shift from into what he called the supramental condition. So that would be another way of thinking about what this transition could mean. Which doesn't mean it's going to happen December 21st, 2012. I think we're seeing the gathering impetus in this area, and it's just because we become more aware of it. We also can help guide it in a way.
One of my favorite quotes is by Alan Watts. He said, the universe is God playing hide and seek with himself.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Question back here?
In your book, 2012, you were I haven't read it recently, but I remember there was some parts in it where you were saying, well, this is going to happen in 2009, or this is going to happen in 2011, and maybe it didn't happen. Like, are you disappointed with some of the things maybe that haven't occurred, or are you keeping a scorecard, or how do you feel about
if you go back and look at the book, I mean, I talked about Kalaman, but I actually critiqued his ideas, because he was saying that there was going to be this, that the Mayan calendar actually was going to end in November 2011, and there would be collective enlightenment at that point, and I actually kind of put that down in the book. But I did end up kind of resonating. The book came out in 2006, with the idea that we'd see a financial crash in 2008, and we did. And actually, a bunch of friends of mine who were, even in finance, were actually quite impressed that I hooked into that. So I think the book, I stand by it. I feel that it's, I think that we're seeing this evolutionary process accelerating, and on so many levels, and we see that even in something like the the Occupy movement. I thought was a really fascinating piece of this evolutionary process, being exposed in a sense, because in New York, like Occupy Wall Street, was seen as a protest movement, and the media actually, obviously did a lot of distortion around it and so on. But actually, it was much more a process movement, and what was happening was really an effort to figure out what is this next level of social organism or social life form that has to emerge, from this over-rigidified structure, of this capitalist, post-industrial disaster. So in that little square of park, they had recycling, gray water, decision-making, open decision-making, a library, a meditation, and a spirituality center, a music area. It was like they created a new cell, in some future social organism, and it was like just breaking up through the crust, of the current situation, and then it was of course stomped down, brutally, but that maybe is also part of the process, and that is going to somehow, that energy, maybe under some other name. I don't even think the name is important, or whatever. But you could see that this next thing is seeking to constellate, and I think we'll see another push in that direction over the next who knows, months or years.
And are you working on any books right now?
Yeah, I mean, I have a book that's long overdue about pretty much about this whole idea of how this shift into this next phase of planetary civilization could occur, and even a strategy for it, which is similar to what I was just talking about with Evolver, which is really, you need some kind of civil society infrastructure that self-organizes and raises consciousness and creates a participatory mode of engagement, where people feel like responsible agents, in a planetary community, rather than, ego-based competitors, seeking their short-term gain, So the book got delayed because of the work on Evolver, which has taken a lot of effort on my part.
Yeah, thanks for Evolver. It's a great
Thank you.
site. Yeah.
More questions or thoughts or comments? Yeah.
So what would you think about, what would you have to say on the idea of maybe trying to step it up a notch and creating like a global network or organization, trying to start accumulating property and creating like eco-social homelands for people to live and grow food and do whatever kind of work they love in order to share with each other and not feel like diaspora on our own home planet?
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a great plan. I mean, the question is, how do you get the capital to buy the land, but I mean, I think we're moving in that direction. I mean, so many people from, there's obviously a ruling elite, who are trapped in a certain mindset. And there's obviously the whole question of how conspiratorial that is, which is a kind of a deep rabbit wormhole that can be pondered till infinity, but on the other hand, there's a lot of people even within the ruling structures who are awakening, but then there's a lot who are not. And even at Burning Man, I see so some of those people would have the capital and resources to help a movement like you're describing, but even at Burning Man, I see right now such a toggling, in a way, coming here for 12 years, there's actually more like social stratification and class stratification here than there were like 10 years ago. You know, have a lot of people who are, because it's become hip, and cool to be here, who come here, but they, they fly in, they have everything set up for them. Their art car is built by like Mexican labor or whatever. I'm serious. It's like, I was at a camp of all these wealthy people visiting a friend there, and they looked like Latinos or whatever. They were clearly hired workers. They were decorating the art car for the wealthy people. There's these shade structures everywhere. Nobody has come yet, so all the shade structures is empty. The workers have a tent right in the middle of the sun next to the art car. So nobody even had like the thought or the empathy to say, you guys could actually have your tent under one of these shade structures that are empty. So in that way, I feel there's still like a big empathy deficit. The only thing I can think of doing is keep calling it to people's attention. Because what we it's easy to empathize with people who are like yourself. It takes a little bit more imagination to empathize with those who aren't. But that's what I mean. In a way, it's like if we're going to evolve into a higher state of a planetized community, that's going to be based on us developing our empathic capacities to a much greater degree. And it seems like a race against time whether that's going to happen to me sometimes, Yeah.
And maybe we could remove some of the financial elitism from the situation by creating a really powerful gift share network so people could exchange exactly what they have to share for exactly what they need in order to create what they love.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things we looked at in my film, we also, through Evolver, we published 2 books on the subject. One is an anthology of essays called What Comes After Money, and the other is a book by Charles Eisenstein called Sacred Economics. And so really looking at the cutting edge of thinking around, what would be an alternative financial model, because, we really have to think about how, when you grow up in capitalist society, you tend to think that the way money is natural and organic. You think, oh, it's just it's almost like a a plant or something. It's just money works in this way. I remember that was like my first mushroom trip. I went to a store to use money, and suddenly I was horrified. I was like, this is the stuff that we care about. It's green and dirty and brown and paper. And then we see that because money, accrues interest, it creates artificial scarcity. The stock market enforces, competition, and enforces, maximizing profit for shareholder value, which means that corporations are almost forced then to degrade or corrupt or avoid environmental regulations and so on. So it's not a sound system. So the question is, so if we step back and we say, okay, money was a human creation, what would be the next form of money or the next ways that people could exchange value? And the first thing you might think is, well, you don't actually need to just have one way to exchange value. There doesn't have to be a monoculture there. You could actually have a whole set of tools for people to exchange value, or ways to do it. And one of them would be what you're saying would be a more developed, trust and gift network, but also where there's tracings of people's histories. So you have that a little bit with something like couch surfing, which I think is a very profound model, for the future, where you take all these relationships that were monetized and you demonetize them, turn them back into trust relationships. Another idea would be a currency that lost value the longer you tried to hoard it or hold on to it, so it would have a negative interest charge. And there were cultures in the past that used such a currency, even in the Middle Ages and so on. So in that sense, if you had a global trading currency that quickly lost value, when you had a surplus of it, you would be much more inclined to share it with the people around you because you really wouldn't be able to hoard it. So that's another idea that's been proposed. There's a set of proposals. Another idea is local credit clearinghouses, where a group of manufacturers and businesses that produce products, goods, and services can band together and create their own credit, and then issue zero interest loans to those who need it in their community. So there's a lot of creative thinking, and that's something we've been doing with Evolver. Is among the events ideas we've been covering is these alternative economic models, and we've had a few spores kind of incubate new currency projects. So in Baltimore, there's one called the B-Note, which is a local currency that's designed to keep money circulating in the community rather than going out to the multinational corporations.
Hi, Daniel. Nice to meet you.
Hi.
I've come all the way from the UK. I want to move away from the corporation size a little bit.
Sure.
I want to know whether you think that the psychedelics, as in DMT and ayahuasca, help or accelerate the sort of awakening or the ascension process as a whole. I mean, years ago I used to experiment with mushrooms and acid. I've never had a bad trip, but I'm going to Peru over the winter solstice. I'm looking to have a go with the ayahuasca. I can get DMT back home. I've not tried it yet, but is it would it accelerate or help my ascension process or the sort of awakening process?
Well, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be maybe prescriptive for any one individual. I mean, you might go and have a horrible time, but in general, I think that yes, for most people, it's a huge catalyst for self-discovery and self-healing, and then kind of processing, all the stuff that you need to process. You can get to another, level of understanding. And I think that ayahuasca is a major catalyst for this planetary shift right now. I mean, it's been very interesting. My last, the Breaking Open the Head came out in 2002, and at that point when I gave talks, like almost nobody knew what it was. And now, even in mainstream communities, it's like well known about, and people are seeking it out for all different reasons. I met these artists at a party, and they were saying that then totally much more straight-laced kind of background, and they were saying now they're finding that a lot of their friends are doing it because they've noticed in the art community that even if somebody's a really bad artist, if they go and do a bunch of ayahuasca, their art gets like much better quickly. So it's really having and it's amazing. It's ayahuasca is a vine, and I feel it's moving kind of like vine-like, sinuously kind of like through our society, where like people are bringing it to like hip hop stars and rock musicians and people in the major ruling elite families and so on. I think it's a major shifter for sure. The other thing I would want to say about it though is it's like, then there are levels in our own learning process, around how to make use of this stuff. Like we're still quite naive about it, So the shaman, in the counterculture has now become lionized as this heroic figure, and some of them are, but also in a lot of Amazonian cultures, the shaman, and the sorcerer are really not that distinct, and the energies of these, that you can almost like build up an energy battery, of psychic force, from using these medicines. But if you're not clean in your intentions, then that can also reverberate negatively, around you.
I mean, when I first experimented with psychedelics, I was I was a kid, so I didn't really understand it, but it gave me a bigger understanding on the broader picture. But now I'm sort of coming through this awakening phase. I like to experiment and go back and dip my toes and see where it leads me now while I'm sort of on this learning curve.
Yeah. You want to pass the next question?
Changing topics again.
Sure.
Do you think? What do you think? Has Burning Man had any cultural impacts outside of this community?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think Burning Man is one of the catalysts. Like ayahuasca or LSD or iboga. I mean, it's. First of all, it's kind of a organic. Rediscovery of these mystery traditions, that you had in ancient Greece, where people would come together for some type of initiatory ritual celebration. It has aspects of all of those things, whether it's like a ritual where you dance for a week and don't sleep, or you take lots of substances and dance for a week and don't sleep, to try to push yourself into another state of consciousness, and I find there are a lot of things. I mean, obviously there's the the gifting culture, there's the way that these different communities or tribes form, and then how they learn how to work together, where you see kind of something very organic happening again, where, for instance, like there are, leaders or chiefs often in the different Burning Man tribes, but that's an honorific earned through like a rational use of authority. It's not from somebody controlling the situation. That won't work. It's somebody who's actually really good at mediating and problem solving and seeing maybe a little further ahead than other people can. So there's some kind of, I think that this is an incredible laboratory for human interaction. And it's crucial, and people come here with such an awakening, leave here with such an awakening of their sense of how much more is possible for human beings than they conceived. I mean, one of the main things that really always has inspired me about it, and obviously there are problems with it, like the class stratification and so on, but how simple it is if you bring people together and you give them a set of different game rules, from the normal society game rules, and if their rules are better or more fun or just lead to better outcomes, how everybody adapts in a moment without even a thought, and even the difficult parts of it become part of the pleasure in a way, So it shows you in a way how easy it would be to you could reconstruct society, with a set of different rules or ideas,
Yeah, I was wondering if you could speak to the importance of shamanic ritual in exploring entheogens, and possibly what are the dangers of it as well? Could you be taken advantage of? Are there cult aspects or
what aspects?
Cult aspects or groups that essentially could take advantage of entheogens as sort of the path to spiritual enlightenment?
Yeah, well, I mean, I generally tend to think that exploring, if you're somebody whose propensity is for psychedelic experience and you have a number of experiences, I think ultimately becomes very important to connect with some type of lineage. Like an indigenous elder lineage, and it's not fully, like, I can't give you a totally rational explanation, but I think my explanation would be that in Tibetan Buddhism, for instance, they talk about the importance of lineage, of connecting with a tradition of past practitioners who've done something for a long time and have done it well and have used it, mainly for the best purposes. I think that has the same effect, and it's almost like there's like a morphogenetic field of protection, around these lineages, So if you connect with them, it's like it's it almost like anchors into your subconscious somehow, like. With Iboga, when I worked with the Bwiti, like ever since then, I would have dreams around, like this big African man or somebody like, Oprah Winfrey, but an African version. And I could just tell, waking up from the dreams, that it was almost like the spirit of Iboga that was still in communication with me and sort of giving me little hints and directions and so on. So yeah, I think it's really it's really important to connect with a lineage, whether it's peyote or ayahuasca, or mushrooms. And I guess I have a little bit of a distinction sometimes between those people, in the psychedelic community who still see it almost entirely in a medicalized context or in a self-exploration context. I think there are other aspects to it, other dimensions to it, and that the field, that's created around these practices, really has a tremendous impact, I mean, for instance, and they can, become a little bit culty, I guess, but everything is a cult in a weird way. I mean, as soon as we start using language, we create a myth, and then that becomes a belief structure, which then becomes like a cult. I mean, psychedelics at least hopefully allow you to keep like breaking down the belief structure that wants to, kind of overtake reality in a way. Yeah.
Hi.
Hey there.
I've been listening to kind of what we're saying, and I just wanted to...
By the way, there's plenty of room up front here if you guys make a card, or people can come in if they want to.
I wanted to know your thoughts on kind of breaking this like 80-20 power structure. We've kind of talked about it in like the Burning Man context. It certainly happened in the Occupy context. You see it in social networks. You see it in developing countries that, the second it starts to organize, that you get this very like elite power structure that looks down and feels superior, and also will kind of hoard the resources. And it seems kind of ingrained not just in human nature, but in actual physical nature as well. And just, as we collectively try to create these solutions, like, what are your thoughts on kind of breaking that pattern that you see, across the board?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think in a way, like, it really comes down to sort of like the underlying cultural mythology or something like that. Like, like in tribal cultures, the chief was generally the person who owned the least possessions because their nobility of spirit was demonstrated by their generosity. So you wouldn't have like a chief like Donald Trump, building the biggest towers and casinos and so on. That would be like atrocious, So because we began to prioritize and value, material possessions, and then I guess you could look at why did we do that? And I think like, the excessive desire for possessions and consumerism, goes back to this kind of spiritual nihilism, because people really don't think there's any continuity of the soul or the spirit. The only value that they have is like, I have to get it all now. Like I gotta, take out the other guy. I've got to like grow as big as I can. But it's total nonsense really, because, if they're still trapped in that nihilistic or materialist worldview, at death, there's not going to be anything anyway, remaining, So, from my perspective, it's first people, going through the inner work to recognize that, we're in a longer cycle, of I think, incarnations, like the Tibetan Buddhists talk about, or Rudolf Steiner talked about in the West, So it's like, then that brings about a deep change of value and perspective. Because then really, what you give is going to be, what the value is,
Yeah, I totally understand, and I'm on the same level.
Yeah.
I feel like when I read all this stuff, we talk a lot about like how things can be, and we walk in a lot of circles about like how do we actually get there? How do we break these structures that are in place?
So my best plan for that has been what I've been seeking to do with Evolver, which is create an alternative media to get more people on board, get people to share information and new ideas, and then build a community infrastructure so that those ideas are anchored in practicality too. I mean, like, the Dalai Lama said that if you want if you want people to change, you have to show them the path to a better life. If they see that path, then they'll take it. So now we're seeing these structures, breaking down, and people are getting, sick and poor and miserable and so on. Well, if, an alternative is presented to them where they can live healthily, by learning how to take care of their own water and their own food again, and it's actually made, through effective media and art, into something beautiful and desirable, where they're actually going to be, relocalizing, reconnecting with their communities and so on, then that I think, provides a way forward,
Thank you. That's really empowering.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that, and in Breaking Open the Head, that you were very disappointed with scientific materialism and the skepticism it kind of fed. But you just mentioned that the value, or one of the values of entheogens, is that they can kind of constantly deconstruct the belief systems that arise out of the experience. How is that not just another form of the same skepticism that you were wrestling with earlier, just in a chemical fashion?
Well, I guess when I get offended by sort of the scientific materialist form of skepticism is I generally, inquire, having done the deep inquiry like myself that the books represent, I had that skepticism, but then I broke through it kind of phenomenologically, by having these experiences that, to me convincingly, irrefutably, in a sense, demonstrate, that there are these other psychic levels of reality. Now, eventually, I would say that there's going to be, a more expanded form of science that will encompass, all these other ways of being and knowing. I feel that the development of science and technology, is an aspect of human evolution and an aspect of the evolution of consciousness. So you could see that our technological projections, really do, constantly transform our way of being and our way of thinking. So and part of this idea of this accelerating process around it is that we're creating tools faster and faster. Those tools then reflect us back on ourselves, which then make us, help us to iterate like the next set of tools, and that's happening like faster and faster, So it's not like saying, I'm not against the scientific project. I just think that in a way what it avoided was the phenomenological experience, which is what some of the philosophers in the 20th century recognized, and it's really where indigenous thought begins. Like even our way of what's that?
Well, do you mean something different between empirical data or evidence and phenomenological? I mean, do you mean it like in purely the Hegelian sense?
It's actually taking yourself in as the primary datum, because you don't. Anything else is just hearsay in a way,
I just wish to mention, to that very point, there is a talk following this one, which will hopefully expound and explore that area of scientific exploration, investigation, and its implications on our lives and its us and the biospheres. And I think it ties in very lovely with the direction this question and answer is going.
I was wondering what you thought about the noosphere, what Jose Arguelles talks about or talked about.
Yeah.
What do you feel about that?
How many people here are familiar with the concept of the noosphere, first of all? So yeah, nous is a Greek word that means mind, and this idea that came from this Russian thinker Vernadsky, who we were just talking about, and a Catholic French paleontologist and mystic Teilhard de Chardin. They came up with this sort of almost simultaneously or congruently came up with this concept of the noosphere. So the nous is a Greek word that means mind. And the idea is that just as the planet has like a biosphere and an atmosphere and a mineral level, which is the lithosphere, there could also be thought of as like an envelope of mind or of thought or of consciousness around the planet. And that noosphere has always been there, and it's been feeding kind of information, through the biosphere, and it's been, spurring us along in this evolutionary development that's included, up to this point, the development of culture and civilizations and technologies and all this stuff. But it's still been somewhat unconscious. So this idea that humanity is going to, consciously kind of access or realize our relationship to the noosphere. I mean, there are thinkers who even give it a physical correlate. They talk about the Van Allen radiation belts and potentially this layer of consciousness or thought around the planet kind of woven between these belts, is one way of thinking about it. So yeah, I mean, one idea that I think is also, for me, if we... A radical idea of what one aspect of this transformational process, would have to do with our latent psychic capacities. I mean, how many people here recognize that we as human beings have psychic capacities? And have had somewhat direct. How many people here think that we don't have any psychic capacities or are just agnostic on it? I'll talk later. But anyway, a lot of more and more people seem to be coming to this realization that we have these psychic abilities that work in different ways. I mean, it can be synchronicities, it can be telepathic foretellings, it can be even sometimes, objects, telekinesis, objects moving around. It can be, somebody taking a psychic blow from somebody that actually like hurts them, if there's a lot of hatred there or something, So this could also be potentially an aspect of the evolution that we're entering into, that in a way, like these shamanic cultures really lived in this realm of the psyche and the realm of magic, but they couldn't, they didn't have the scientific and technological infrastructure that we have. Well, maybe, we could actually begin to access our psychic capacities, in a cooperative framework, for positive benefits on the earth. So for instance, like, in my book I wrote about the Hopi. And there was a Cambridge anthropologist who lived with the Hopi for years, and he was a skeptical empiricist, but he had to admit, from his time with them, that they were able to do things that he didn't have an explanation for in his way of understanding things. Like sometimes he would go to meet one of the elder Hopi with a list of questions, and the guy would answer each question in order without him asking any of them. And he said that sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes he would go to one of their rain dances, and clouds would gather after like 20 minutes of dancing and like a blazing hot sun, rain would fall. And he said that this happened often enough that it seemed that they were influencing the climate conditions. We also see things like the Global Consciousness Project at Princeton University, which put random number generators around the planet and began to discover that, when there were major events of a collective global awareness, like the O.J. Simpson verdict or 9/11, these random number generators would deviate from randomness, and they would go into some kind of higher state of coherence. So they began to see that just observing these generators around the planet, they were beginning to see the emergence of something like a global brain brain, or at least the global nervous system. And they also noted things that, like with 9/11, although the deviation from statistical randomness peaked a few hours after the planes hit the building, it started a few hours before. So not only was there understanding after the fact, it was almost, there was like an innate precognition, that something was about to happen in the collective field. So one of my, I guess, I'm very taken with Jose's idea, and I think one of the aspects of us becoming, consciously aligned or self-realizing humanity as a collective organism, in conjunction with this noosphere, might be that we are going to go into a conscious use of our psychic capacities. And an analogy for this would be what happened with electricity. In the 18th century, we discovered, Benjamin Franklin flew the kite, he got hit by the lightning, they discovered there was this tremendous force, but for, a number of decades, they didn't really know what to do with it. At first, you didn't know how to store it, you didn't know how to transmit it reliably, and once humanity figured out how to make use of that energy, in merely like 100, 150 years, we were able to change the entire biogeochemical environment of the Earth, through the power of thought, and through this energy that we'd come into contact with. So the idea would be that if we see the tendency, this is what the Vernadsky talks about in the biosphere, of human thought having become, a geophysical event on the planet over the last centuries, there might also be another leap in that, where our co-creative capacities increase to a whole nother dimension.
So synchronicities and psychic abilities seem to be enhanced while on psychedelics, I've noticed, and it's been pretty profound through my life.
How many people feel that they have more synchronicities and psychic events on psychedelics? Okay, we covered that.
Yeah.
So go ahead. Oh, did you finish your question?
Oh, that was what I was just making a statement more than anything, but I appreciate the noosphere.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks.
you.
Jose had the idea also that there could be like a, an event would mark this development of the noospheric consciousness. And his idea was to do a global meditation on creating a circumpolar rainbow bridge on the date of the last day of the Mayan, the Mayan long count, which is December 21st, 2012. And he believed that if enough people were to do this, it could create this visible rainbow around the Earth. Now, I know that sounds far-fetched. I have a number of friends who did a workshop with him in the early 90s in South America, which was all about the Rainbow Bridge. And apparently on the last day, as they came out of the last meditation, there were rainbows all over the sky, And then recently, we had an Evolver event in Pittsburgh, and as part of my talk, I was talking about this stuff in the Rainbow Bridge. The next day, right after our closing ceremony, we went outside and there was a double rainbow across the sky. So I mean, I myself don't exactly know how much credence to place in it, but it seems like there's something wants to occur. So I mean, if you guys want to get involved with the Rainbow Bridge meditation, you can look it up. I mean, Jose Arguelles' Rainbow Bridge, he gives you the how to do it and so on. And Evolver also published a book called Manifesto for the Noosphere, which was the last book Jose wrote before he died last year. And that has a lot of information about the Noosphere and the Rainbow Bridge in it. If we can't make it for 2012, maybe we can work on it for 2013 or 14.
Right.
Work in progress.
I know Jose talked about the time quake that happens, or
what's that? Let me see if there's any other questions for anybody else. Yeah, back there.
Hi, I was wondering if you could speak about, with the rise of the use of shamanic plants and shamanic rituals, just about cultural reappropriation in the way that you see these ceremonies being performed everywhere. And it almost has seemed to me in some of my travels to be like this parallel industry, sort of like in this industry of enlightenment, that if you have enough money, you can do enough ceremonies to get there, or sort of this idea that I've seen people have, and wondering, with all these ceremonies taking place, the dangers of people misusing them or not fully understanding them.
Yeah, in a way, it's kind of chaos out there right now. But I mean, that's kind of the situation we're in. We're still learning about this stuff, and I think that's probably a necessary part of the process. People have asked me, some people get very negative about the idea of ayahuasca tourism, but from my, perspective, it's actually very valuable. Like we've done retreats now with Sequoia elders from Ecuador, and basically in their own context, they've got the missionaries and the oil companies preying upon them. There's about 700 of them left, and whatever's left of their ayahuasca culture is quickly evaporating. Actually having rich, comparatively rich white people work with them, care about their knowledge and so on, it actually keeps the knowledge alive, and even then, if it becomes an economic avenue for them, then their grandkids don't have to go work for the oil companies. They could actually train in these indigenous, their native practices. So I think actually, handled properly, it can be a very positive thing. And but right now it's like, it's an open field, and a lot of different efforts are being tried, and some people are manipulative, and that's where you really have to, as with anything, that's so delicate and crucial, to your own evolution, you have to use great discernment. You don't just go to any shaman, talk to people who've worked with that person, or research them, carefully, I mean, for me, I was really helped by having a journalist background, because it gave me the tools to kind of investigate, before having these types of experiences. 5 more minutes? Okay. Yeah. But I think it has to be a good thing. I mean, ayahuasca is now becoming like something you need to do if you're part of a certain culture, in the same way yoga became, 10 or 15 years ago. And, that's also been kind of baldrilized, and often it's more of just like an exercise program than, people really, I mean, if you look at the bodies of the great yogis, in their 70s or 80s, they don't look like super fit. They often have like really strange bellies, and they're not looking for a great body. They're looking for to break the bonds of existence and achieve some kind of liberation. So yes, I mean, but even so, in the transitional phase, it's awesome. That's become a major cultural trend, and I think it's awesome that ayahuasca is becoming a major cultural trend. And then also, I think often that's I mean, when something becomes hip, those people who want to be hip will do it, and once they do, but with ayahuasca, it's once again, it's a phenomenological experience that actually transforms you, from the inside, so let's make that as hip as we possibly can,
So I'm just noticing in this conversation that when we talk about dawning this new era and the breakdown of social structures and institutions that are created that we need to rethink, I'm just aware that most of these institutions were created under a patriarchy. So as we move towards this new era, particularly when we talk about ayahuasca, which is a feminine representation of this new era, how do you see that fitting in? What roles of women and the divine feminine do you see for helping facilitate that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that we have to, somehow evolve into a true partnership society. We're not obviously, we're not going to flip back to matriarchy, but we're seeing the disintegration of the patriarchal form and the sort of the ego structure, maybe, which is kind of the exemplary aspect of that, or the negative aspect of that, So how does that look? I mean, it's something that I think about a lot. And I'm probably going to talk, I'm giving a talk on Thursday at Red Lightning at 5:45. I've been visiting recently a community in Portugal called Tamara, which was started by German philosophers. They first had a community near Berlin called Zeg, and then they started Tamara about 20 years ago. And essentially what they recognized was, working in the left in the 70s in Germany, that these issues around love, gender, sexuality were the core issues that were core political issues that really weren't being dealt with, and they were leading to the breakup of these communities or these movements and so on. So they basically created like a research and development community laboratory to break through to different models of relationship. And what they've devised is a sharing and non-possessive model of love and relationship, where it's like a community structure that has a number of different social technologies that that take a lot of stuff that's private in our world and make it public and transparent so everybody can see it and know it, rather than it being like an underground subtext that feeds like envy, competition, and jealousy. So I'll talk more about that, you know, on Thursday. Yeah, but yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, this idea of the rising of the feminine again, the divine feminine, or the, you know, is an aspect of it. And obviously, it's not just, you know, in women; it's also men contacting their feminine nature. You know, so they can, you know, we all have both within us. You know, and if men could go back more into that receptive mode, you know, rather than always having to be the ones pushing, you know, into oblivion, you know, that's part of the shift also, you know.
And you said that's Thursday at 5:45?
Yeah, at Red Lightning. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, cool. I think that is stop time. Yeah. Thank you so much for listening. I'll hover around outside, so come say hi and talk to me. And I have like a little propaganda of various sorts I can give to you if you want propaganda. You know. Thank you so much.